Good morning, everyone. Let me try you. We're doing a call and response thing. So I say good morning, and then you say good morning. Yeah, thank you. That's really good. So that's much appreciated, Reverend. Thank you. Much appreciated. And so welcome to day 2 of the Faultlines Democracy Conference. We have a lot of interesting additions to the conversation that we began yesterday. Today's panels are Saving America, Covering Vulnerable Communities, and also our Democracy Town Hall. And we are fortunate to have a video message from President Obama as well. And so we're eager to get started. And so thank you everyone for coming out. And we'll get the next panel underway shortly. We have another video clip for you in the interim. I'd like to welcome our panelists for our first panel of the day, Saving America, which will be moderated by Eugene Robinson. And then we have as panelists the journalist Subrata Day, my colleague at the journalism school, Zeynep Tufekci, and the historian and my former upstairs neighbor, Eric Foner.
I think this is on. Good. Well, thank you, Dean Cobb. I just want to start off today by, of course, thanking my fellow panelists and thanking all of you for coming out, but especially thanking Jelani Cobb for organizing this really incredible and I think important conference. You know, it is, this is really good, and it's, I think we should see it as a beginning, not, certainly not an end, but I have thought and said for a long time that we need to grapple on every level with what is happening with our democracy, what is happening with the media in this country, and what it is we might be able to do to save democracy, to save media, to save things that I think are really important to this country and to the world. And Colombia has a unique ability to convene a group like this. You know, yesterday we had the executive editors of the, 2 most important and influential newspapers in the United States right here on the stage together. I urged both of them to get together after the meeting to have a discussion and figure out how we're going to avoid having artificial intelligence do to our new business models what the internet did to our old business model, but because it's important. If we're going to do anything, we have to be here. But anyhow, thank you, Jelani, for doing this, and I think it's a really important. Congratulations to you. And so the theme you have given us is Saving America. So absolutely, panelists, no pressure whatsoever. As much as I'd like to just kind of keep it light, but we do have to take stock of the moment we're in. Why are we talking about Saving America? So I think I'm going to start with Eric. Some would say one of the greatest, I would say the greatest historian, certainly, of the 19th century in this country. You have written so much. You've written about the fiery trial. You've written about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. You've written about the second founding, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 15th Amendments and Reconstruction. I want to just, briefly give us context. That was a period when this country might not have survived. It did, at tremendous cost. Give us a sense of perspective as to where we are now. We had an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. I mean, where are we now in that sort of historical frame?
First, thanks to Jelani and others for inviting me, although I do feel a little bit out of place. I'm not a journalist. I know some journalists, but I don't claim to be an expert. I don't know what the future of journalism is. I really represent the consumer. I read the newspaper every day. So what all of you are producing gets to me eventually. But I do want to, I retired from teaching history here at Columbia a few years ago, and one of my regrets in my career here is that very, very few students from the journalism school ever crossed the college walk to take a history class or just to sit in on a history class. And although I was always welcoming to the few who wanted to do that, but I came away, and my general experience, with many exceptions in this room and other places, is that journalists need to know more history. I think historians need to know more about how journalism operates, but journalists need to know more history. I frequently get phone calls from journalists in New York and in other places asking what really are pretty simple historical questions, which someone who went to college probably should know the answer to, but they want me to tell them what happened at one point or another in our history. That's fine. I always engage in these conversations. But let me just say, in terms of context, the first thing to remember is democracy has always been contested in this country. It is not something that existed in a pristine form and then suddenly has been going downhill. The Constitution, the original Constitution, was not a democratic document. The people who wrote the Constitution were not Democrats in a current understanding of that term. The right to vote, the Constitution, the way that the president is elected, as we sort of discover every 4 years, is certainly not a democratic method. And in fact, this is the only country in the world, I believe, that has an electoral college system to elect the chief of state. Even countries where the United States basically wrote their constitutions for them, like Germany and Japan after the Second World War, they didn't put the electoral college into their constitutions. They were too smart to do that. The right to, and of course the Supreme Court is unelected, as we all know, and serves for life and is a very undemocratic institution. And the right to vote was limited in many ways for much of American history. At the beginning, I should say parenthetically that when I was teaching here, the average length, the length of a lecture class was 1 hour and 15 minutes. So that's what I'm used to doing, so I'll be speaking for that length.
We might want to just keep that a little shorter today, Eric.
Okay. But my point is, you can track the right to vote and hold office through 19th and 20th century America, and how those restrictions on democracy actually changed over time. At the beginning, it was mostly class, that if you had to own property of a certain kind, you had to pay taxes of a certain kind. Of course, slaves could not vote, but free black people could vote, actually, at the time of the American Revolution in most of the states. But in the first part of the 19th century, you might almost say race replaced class as the dividing line among men. Women could not vote anywhere, of course, at this point. But the word white was written into state constitutions all over the country to as one of the qualifications for voting. And so the country democracy became a very popular thing when Alexis de Tocqueville came over here in the 1820s, 30s. He came to study prisons, but then he realized when he got here, I'm writing the wrong book, so let me change. What really makes America interesting is democracy. But he also noted that it was a racial democracy. And that changed, of course, with the Civil War and Reconstruction and the three great constitutional amendments, which were supposed to make this a democratic society of equals, and transformed the Constitution into something it never had been, a document to which people could appeal who felt they were being denied equality. The word equality is put into the or equal protection of the law in Reconstruction. By my estimate, about 1,500 African-American men held some public office during Reconstruction. The right to vote spread throughout the country for men again, with race no longer a barrier, at least according to the 15th Amendment. One could go on and on with this, but I'm not going to at the moment. But the main point, but people were still fighting into the 20th century. There's always been people who feel that too many people are voting, and you see that today in voter restriction laws, voter suppression laws, and efforts to take public issues out of the realm of democracy. Just yesterday or the day before, the New York Times had an article about states where referendums and things like that are being eliminated in order to prevent people from voting on the right to terminate a pregnancy. So we are still contested about who is an American. The first words of the Constitution, "we the people," does not tell us actually who the citizens of the United States actually are, but again, Reconstruction and the changes in the laws and the Constitution there finally address that issue all the way up to the current moment. So I am going to stop there. I could go on about the threats to democracy in our history, but I think the first thing we have to remember as context is it is not new for groups of Americans to try to suppress democracy and or to overturn elected, the results of elections. In Reconstruction, that happened quite a few times where white mobs, January 6th was not the first time that elected governments were overturned in this country by violent white supremacist mobs. And I think we have to remember that rather than seeing some golden age of the past where democracy flourished with no problems and now suddenly it's all going downhill, we have to look deeper into the nature of our political culture over time and see, as I said, democracy's always been contested.
Just two quick observations on that. Number one, my great-grandfather was one of those African Americans who held elective office. He was elected coroner of Orangeburg County in South Carolina. Number two, he, after the disputed presidential election of 1876, in which there were, claims of election fraud, slates of fake electors, very close election, the compromise that ended that withdrew the troops from the former Confederacy, the Union troops, which protected the rights of people like my great-grandfather, and so then he couldn't be an elected official anymore, and in the fullness of time, couldn't vote anymore in his state. But and so that definitely happened in reaction. So these pullings back of democracy often happen in reaction. I would argue we're in pulling back that may have something to do with the election of the first African-American president of the United States and his having served 2 terms. You, Zeynep, back in 2016 when you saw Donald Trump sort of coming out of the woodwork and everyone's laughing about him. I remember I wrote a column calling him a farce to be reckoned with, but the rest is history. You saw something happening on social media. You saw something going on And was that in reaction? Was race part of that reaction? What did you see?
So it ties to two things in that era from 2012 to 2016, after President Obama got reelected. One of the first things that connects to this in 2012, when I'm just an academic back then, I wrote a column, op-ed. I wasn't a columnist. I wrote a little op-ed, my very first op-ed for the New York Times, after his election, saying, there's a lot of articles you may have forgotten, but it was so widespread, celebrating Facebook as savior of democracy and big technology as this great democratic door that helped President Obama and his geeks got elected. It was all this very celebratory mood. So I wrote a little op-ed saying, it's not necessarily that good. There's a lot of problems with it. I don't begrudge any campaign.
With social media.
Yeah, any campaign wanting to win using whatever tools. And I had back and forth with many Obama administration officials and his campaign people who were very, very mad at me and remained mad at me for 4 years until the day after Trump got elected, and I got some apology phone calls, but it was by then not really sort of, it was what it was. And one thing they kept telling me was that technology will always be on our side, Facebook is great for us, Silicon Valley loves us, this will be our tool. So I said two things back then. I said, one, you go read a history book, or two. The idea that technology or any new tool will always be on your side is delusional. There is no such thing. And if you read the history of movies, films, the Birth of a Nation is the founding film of the movie industry in this country. Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's filmmaker, is one of the most talented, innovative filmmakers of her era, to both pernicious, terrible, horrible effect in both cases. You can have, you just look at the pre-World War II era. There was a huge intertwining with new technologies and rise of fascism. It wasn't the only thing, for sure. It never is. Read a history book once again. Germans have word for these phenomenon. And I'm from Turkey, so we kind of have many words for this phenomenon. Occasionally happens to us too. I really argued back and forth, and there was all these young, optimistic, idealistic people who said, no, this will always be on our side. I said, this is delusional. And so that understanding the context of technology and social change and also the political scene is very important. But the second thing for me, when Trump candidacy started in, with the, came down the Trump Tower elevator or escalator, whatever, and everybody was making fun of his speech patterns. There was all these transcripts of his run-on sentences on Twitter, and I was hearing all of this. And at the time, I was at University of North Carolina, and I had done my grad school in Austin, so I was, while not born in the US, I had become more embedded in the South in all sorts of ways that perhaps were helpful for me to try to evaluate what this was going on, because being dropped into the South as a foreign but white person is a quick education in, because you get treated in a particular way, you don't understand the code, and you have to, it was a rapid education. So when I started seeing this at first, I also thought, one more, because there's all these candidacies on the Republican side are like grift. They want to sell a book, they go become a candidate. But of course, I'm a scholar of technology and social movements and all of those things. So I started following the social media side and thinking, this is fitting into other patterns I had seen. I had studied the Arab Spring and had sort of ups and downs. So I decided to do what I think journalism does when it does best, which is I went to Trump rallies. And to my real horror, the press were sitting in a pen. And they were like, Trump said, you're all gonna sit in the pen, and they did. I was like, why are you all here? Just leave one person, YouTube stream. This is not something, I did not. I was like, I'm not gonna do this. And I went and started talking to people. There's been a lot of derision of the diner interview. And you can do it badly, but you do need to talk to the people at some point, not just watch the YouTube stream and make fun of his transcripts. And what I saw in that big rally was, one, the transcripts were completely unrepresentative. He was a very talented politician. Yes, he mumbled a word or two, but it was kind of like the way he worked Twitter was he would like float something, feel the room. if it didn't work, he would change. And if you just read the transcript of an oral thing, it's not very, it doesn't make sense. In the room, it made perfect sense to that audience. He had the audience. And I also saw him come up with what I would call realignments of the mixing basically certain very racial themes with criticisms of excess military spending and all of this. These are very common themes in history, once again. And I thought he has a chance. This is a viable candidate. This needs to be taken seriously. So I wrote my first morning op-ed in, I think, March 2016. It was, people thought I was crazy. And you're Turkish, you're a little paranoid. And then we know what happened. And I'm going to wrap up with, once he started in 2020, when he started contesting the election. At the time, I was deep into doing pandemic work. So I was just writing about the pandemic and all of that. So I hadn't really been writing about all of this. I wrote 2 pieces. I took a break from my pandemic piece. I wrote 2 pieces, basically comparing his election denial and incitement efforts. In one piece, I remember comparing it to Checo's gun. If it's there, it's going to come in play. I was like, you do not take this lightly. You do not. This is playing with fire. He's doing it in front of everybody's face, and everybody's kind of like, oh, what's going to happen? I'm like, this is not how you treat something like this. The last one, I wrote 2, and the last one is published on January 5th, saying this is a loaded weapon. Stop making fun of it. And in both cases, I would say the reporting I tried to do as a person, as a columnist, helped. Having read, including yours, I'm such a big fan, many history books definitely helped. And also trying to sort of do current understanding of the science and technology and how it was affecting the public sphere really helped. And I think if we do this as journalists, as academics, as columnists, as whatever our role, we can be more reactive before things happen, rather than having these panels after they happen and where we dissect the past and then we all get doom and gloom and it kind of goes on. So I'm just sort of trying to sort of really urge this deeper thinking. And for journalists, absolutely, history is such it's part of reporting, understanding these currents.
Absolutely. I'm getting it on your Twitter feed immediately, so I know the next time we're about to have an insurrection. So Subrata, one of here we got a bunch of journalists and academics, and there's a certain frustration, certainly on my part. A lot of times I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. I'm preaching to people who are roughly my age, who roughly have similar views, and who say, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I feel like I'm not reaching people who don't already agree with me. I think that's a problem with a lot of what we would call legacy media. Vice, which you run, is I think, really interesting and really good, and really manages to reach younger viewers, younger people who are not necessarily traditional, everyday legacy media consumers. Talk a bit about that. Talk about reaching people who might not already be persuaded that we're right.
As a veteran of legacy media, I think, and now almost 5 years at Vice News, it's been the greatest education and also the greatest exercise in sort of a renewal of optimism in the future, and certainly the future of journalism and potentially our beloved democracy. 85% of our newsroom is under 40. We have one of our brilliant journalists here, Dan Ming, sitting in the room on the front lines every day. And people respond, and the audience responds. And yes, it's true, the majority of our audience is also under 40. I consider that very young. Because our rule is that you have to be on the ground, and you have to live, breathe, see, or feel that story in some way. There is no kind of culture of talking about a story unless you've actually been on the ground to report the story. And if I may just sort of speak about, this next generation, they feel an incredible sense of betrayal, justifiably, by all of the systems that have been put in place to sort of deliver their future to them. And so I think they are, in many ways, the most discerning audience and have responded to our content because they get to make decisions for themselves. One of the big messages in our newsroom is that cover America like you would any country. And if you are questioning other authoritarian regimes, as we do all the time, we are constantly, we're in a battle for our lives, really, in India and other places. We need to cover America in the same way. And being in an organization in which we are not welcome in the corridors of power has changed the way we do our journalism. And I did, I don't know, dozens and dozens of interviews with President Obama. I was at the White House. I did all of that. Yeah. But there is something that is very instructive of not being in those sort of corridors, in those rooms, and having a completely different perspective on what is unfolding. Informed by history, you need to connect the dots. But I would argue that, this younger generation are living the effects of this very long legacy and are very well aware of, kind of the historical costs of where we are today, and have connected those dots because they are facing down 25 years before climate truly has that impact. They are facing a very different job market. They're facing, a different bank account. I mean, I could go on and truly just do not have control over their own bodies in a way that we did. So it is on some level, I think they live and breathe the kind of attacks on democracy every day. And because we're a scrappy organization, many of our journalists are, as many. I think it's the Times and the Washington Post that truly, during the Trump administration, as somebody who has been in television news, I fully give credit to those organizations for really holding, truth to power and accountability and calling for accountability in a way that I think others could not. But I think now, because people are in the field, they're really in the front lines in this country in a way that's true, has happened historically, but many things are now coming, we are down to the line in ways that I think the newsroom feels in a very personal way. So it's alarming, but also it's real, and people are doing incredible work as a result. And I always say, the platforms are an issue, and that's a long conversation to get into, but you cannot discount the fact that you are able to reach people in a way that you couldn't before. And that is a dilemma I face every single day, because when you look at the stories we're able to do and how we first learn about them, it is through social channels. And in Myanmar, in Iran, in every place, it is technology on some level that has helped. And there is a tie-in to the future of sort of democracy, but it's absolutely to be determined how, what the outcome is.
And that's going to be my next question after a bit of run-up. But, so my hopes for journalism now, my, two-item wish list is that, number one, I sort of hope that the wheel is turning in the way you just described, and that we're getting out of this period in which the reward systems were such that journalists spend, in Washington, in New York, spend a lot of time sort of worrying about and working on access to power, and because that's so valued in the profession. So if you are covering, Congress, or you're covering the White House, the ability to have continued access to decision makers, to powerful people, is your coin of the realm, and you advance by that. That's sort of the incentive system to far too great an extent, I think, because it brings you closer to power. It makes you focus on that at the exclusion of everything else, and you end up with a kind of access journalism, which is a bane. It's a plague, I think. It's a bad thing, and you know, not that we don't have to cover the White House and cover Congress and try to cover the Supreme Court, but that you know, we need to look out, and we need to that should not be the be all and end all in journalism. So I hope that's changing. We need to change it more. And my second hope is that as we have this conference, right, as we talk as journalists and academics about what we can do to protect our democracy at a perilous moment, to call out lies, to warn of dangers. You know, are we bringing, you know, a penknife to a gunfight? I mean, because I worry less about the person who sits at home and watches Fox News 24 hours a day. That's a relatively small number of people, but they're in touch, those people are in touch through social media with a whole lot more people. And so I worry more about the person who's not really a news consumer as we traditionally think of him or her, but who, you know, heard, he saw a post from Uncle Fred, you know, about how Hunter Biden is a cannibal and a pedophile, and has, you know, taken $30 billion from China, and everybody knows that, and this is, you know, the biggest evil in our society right now. And that came through social media. And and I just throw this open to the panel. I know you've written about social media, but how do we compete on this new battlefield, this new information battlefield, effectively? Because I don't think we're doing it now.
All right, I will just go because, so the reason I had wanted more reform and regulation on the incentive structure on social media wasn't because I wanted it to go away. I'm similar to what you're describing, is that it's been a path to both voice and democratization around the world in many ways. And what I was worried about was the business model and engagement model based on the ads was driving certain kinds of content, and I thought there could be other incentive structures and other business models that would allow for a healthier transition, which is not something we face this with journalism as well, right? Pre-World War II, post-World War II journalism is quite different in both business models, ethics, and other things. Now, here, I want to say, going forward, certain degrees of regulation, incentives, self-regulation, I think will be necessary. But for the press and for sort of the legacy institutions that have certain kind of power in the space, what I do see a lot, either explicitly or implicitly, is nostalgia. And I want to say it's both not feasible, because that world's not coming back, and also it wasn't that great either. Like, there were problems with it. There were all sorts of things that we saw yesterday on some of it discussed. And what happens is, because there's also this peril, it's like the panel yesterday. I thought there was this, you might have sort of witnessed it. There was an incident, there was heckling, it wasn't very coherent. We got to see our dean in action. We're very proud, and all of that. But one of the things that I thought about is, this is like a little microcosm of the problem, is that we see a peril, and you kind of get defensive. But on the other hand, there are very sane, very grounded, very real criticisms, like the access journalism, like the herding, the groupthink, that I can give you example after example, both from history but currently, that legacy media, I don't think, has fully grappled with. And social media is both a channel that kind of allows it, but because of all the things, it's not really there. So, and you have to compete with those audiences by building your credibility, building your trustworthiness, doing all the things that journalists are supposed to do. And sometimes I think the defensiveness, like the way we're defensive to incoherent hecklers, is completely justified. But the challenge is not to let that bleed into defensiveness that makes us just get nostalgic rather than say, wait, like just because those hecklers are incoherent doesn't mean we don't need to have this very real, very profound conversation on why don't some people trust us? You can blame others, fine. You can blame the people who are like misinforming, lying, fine. All of you can do that, but that's not something you could be controlled. Our job is to say, what can we do in this particular setting to create the better business models, to create the incentives, to create the journalism that makes people think we want this. And I don't think there's any other way out. Like, we can tell each other how great we are, but that's not really getting us to where we should be going.
Other thoughts? Yeah.
It's hard to separate out, sort of in this conversation, the business of journalism and the attention economy and where we find ourselves, which is what I think you're getting to, Zeynep. And I think it's dangerous to kind of blame social media for all of it. It really is, it's kind of sort of the business proposition of journalism and any new platform and what it could potentially provide. And I think that's really the very big question for us is, there is an audience for good journalism, and trust is incremental. I think that while it's true, we live in a country in where people want a scoop in a moment, and with that perhaps comes, exactly that, the attention they desire. And I understand that completely, and I'm not immune from that. But to have a kind of mechanism in which people can do incremental, consequential journalism over a span of time as kind of a ballast, against whatever it is that's coming is really important. And that is very difficult to do. And social media provided what felt like and continues to feel like independence. I know that's not true. However, this is why we're talking about regulation, and at least I think we are now in a much more honest conversation about where we truly sit around the platforms and what we're going to do moving forward. But we're in this. I think it's now up to us to try to figure it out, because if you talk, I think, to most journalists, and all of us watch other kind of new vehicles very closely, they believe in independence and funding their own journalism. And really, right? Like, we're in the world now where, okay, I'm going to have subscribers that follow me and believe in what I do. And that scares some of us because we believe we need a big machine out there to fight whatever threats we're feeling. I don't know that that's necessarily true.
I mean, that's interesting. There is, the new landscape does provide space for everybody, and it provides space for the people who are maliciously spreading disinformation, but it also provides space for people who are spreading truth and who are doing good work. I don't know how we deal with the way the algorithms work, and the way, frankly, that the human brain works, and the fact that the crazy story totally made up about Hunter Biden's pedophilic cannibalism goes viral in a way that a story about whatever the fairly boring contents of Hunter Biden's laptop might be would go viral. And that's a difficult thing to grapple with, because we're talking about us. Eric, any historical thoughts on this, or especially as a non-journalist, because you're a consumer?
Yeah, as I say, my thoughts always is this working? Sorry,
Just got to hold it up.
My thoughts often, go back to history. I mean, in the 19th century, yesterday there was a lot of talk about objectivity, and is this something that journalists ought to strive for, or is it a kind of trap where you therefore can't make any judgments about anything? I mean, I used to tell my students that objectivity does not mean you have an empty mind. It means you have an open mind. Being willing to change your mind is sort of essential to objectivity. But anyway, in the 19th century, most newspapers were directly tied to a political party. I mean, Fox News is a updated example of this, was a change, different technologically, but newspapers were part of the political structure of different parties, and people expected that. If you looked at the way the Lincoln-Douglas debates were reported in a Democratic newspaper in Illinois versus a Republican one, you'd think you were reading about two completely different events. So the notion of objectivity really didn't exist in journalism. It was the point of newspapers was to spread the outlook of the political party. Whether that is, still in some ways the case with many forms of journalism, I'm not quite sure. But I think just one other thing, as a consumer listening to this and being interested, I think one of the things that wasn't really discussed yesterday, but has come up today, and I'm glad to hear it, is what is a possible business model for journalism today in the current situation, and what are the implications of a sort of corporate leaning of many forms of journalism.
This is key. This is really key, because one of the things that made that middle of the road journalism possible was, like, if you are getting ad money from regular corporate America that just wants to reach broad audiences, and you have the sort of ethical codes and the wall between editorial and advertising, which is not perfect and affects many things. You can talk about climate, other things, but it was a thing. That was a model that was different from what he's talking about, where you had the partisan press that was funded because it was partisan. So the advertising-based print journalism, and also the 3 evening broadcasts that were both license and advertisement kind of oligopolies, to be frank. That's why you could have Walter Cronkite. So it's not just like, oh, he was great and we are not great. There was a business model that incentivized the emergence of a few people like that, because that also fit with who the advertisers wanted to reach. It is not that world anymore. But the important, I think, thing here is that in any society, you need to have those centrifugal, dissenting, pulling apart forces. Otherwise, you get stagnation, authoritarianism, totalitarianism. That's just part of what makes democracies vibrant. But on the other hand, you need those bringing together, consensus making, that what you might call the boring middle of the road things that generate this, what do we as a society want to do? And that is what the contestation of democracy has always been, right? Who gets to say that? How do we say that? Who counts as the people? And how do we do that? And that's why the social media part, the business model part, the democracy part, you have to take all of that into account and say, how do we create ways in which whatever the algorithmic, et cetera, are, people trust us, people seek us. One thing I saw with the pandemic, where I did a lot of work, was like, as the WHO and the CDC did some missteps on a couple of key things, I was involved in recognizing airborne transmission, et cetera. There was a large number of people who otherwise are absolutely believers in science, public health, all of that. They lost their trust. And on social media, I see them get preyed upon every day by people with sometimes MDs and PhDs and other things who are just lying to them. And they're able to get to those people because those people have lost trust in the CDC and WHO. So if you want to fix that, it's not a Twitter fix, ban this liar account, ban this misinforming account. It's a fix the CDC and WHO so that it gains the trust, so that it can speak over those people and reach those people and be believed. So it's like the demand. If the demand is there, the supply is there. That's what you have to kind of address. So it goes back to you fix society as a whole, and you see this as one part of a big thing that we need to tackle. And it's not just social media, it's because our institutions and our democracy failed in ways that we need
You have
to
to
address.
support local journalism,
Yes.
Social media is replacing that, and we saw this. I mean, I think if we talk to anybody running a campaign, they would say it's all at the local level, and it really is all at the local level. That is where it has most impact, and we all have to do it.
Where the rubber meets the road. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to invite people to start lining up at the microphone to ask questions. I'm going to ask Eric one final little question that just occurs to me, and it could be completely wrong, but was the Telegraph and this instant communication that it provided, was that the social media of its time? And did it have as much of a disruptive sort of power?
Yeah, I mean, instantaneous communication is not new. I mean, as you say, the telegraph by the 1860 was all over the whole country. Very soon, at the Atlantic cable, you could suddenly get instantaneous news from Europe. So, yeah, people had to grapple with that. Of course, there weren't all these different sites on the internet that one could go to. But yes, journalism has always had to try to deal with how to convey the
Arguably
instantaneous
1848
information.
Too. Like the trains carrying the newspapers and
trains,
the people spring in 1848. These are
I'm saying the post office was by far the most important disseminator of information in the 19th century, and that's how newspapers circulated through the people would get their newspaper from the post office every day or whatever, and a lot of people read newspapers in the 19th century. A lot of them.
This will all get better when Elon Musk plants give us implants in our brains, and then we just kind of know what he thinks at all times, as if we don't already. All right, first question, please.
Hi, my name is Turku Işıksel. I teach political science here. My question is about the mission or the purpose of the press and of the media in a democratic society, which has traditionally been understood as, casting sunlight in the dark crevices of power. There's the flawed analogy of, sunlight being the best disinfectant, which it turns out it's not. But so that idea of the mission of a free press in a democratic society is under strain now. Dean Cobb alluded to this yesterday, of the politician who gets caught red-handed, right? And the press's job is to expose that. But now we have George Santos, right, who gets caught all sorts, red-handed in all sorts of situations. We have Donald Trump. So no matter how many times press organizations call a lie, right? We're seeing a new breed of politician, of leader, who is really immune to shame, right? Who's really immune to sunlight, to go back to that analogy. That is so I wonder how, of course, that has a trust aspect, right? Trust, the erosion of trust in traditional media outlets. It also has a polarization aspect. So I'm just wondering how we think about that mission in a kind of post-shame political scene. Thanks.
Are we post shame? I think that the core mission remains the same, which is really centered around accountability, and I don't know that there isn't. It's not about shame. It's about accountability, and it's about exposure and reporting the facts, and that doesn't change. And I think that, if you want to take George Santos as an example, and certainly the local journalists in Long Island who were the first to report that story, I think that stands on very solid ground, and things take time. I know we all kind of, all of us, depending on our political leanings, have this vein of kind of outcome and activism. I think some do. I understand that, and a sense of justice, but that takes time, and what you first need is a bedrock of fact and sort of solid information and consistency. And I would argue that that is achieved every day in most newsrooms, and that's really our mission.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly mention the dissolution of the local newspaper business model, basically because there was a time when the New York Times had a bunch of reporters out in on Long Island, and Newsday was there, and as soon as that weekly started asking questions about it, it would have been amplified, it would have been a huge deal, and he never would have gotten
because the impact is on his community, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's his community most affected by that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the community. So, next question.
So at many news organizations, a lot of resources are going towards writing that first draft of history. You mentioned how a fluency in history can help inform that reporting. Also curious what other steps, concrete steps, news organizations can take to bring in historical context. And then also, very hard to forecast and see the future, but ways that they can invest there to help make it a little less ephemeral.
So, I mean, this is a tough one. So the thing is, with social media and with internet, with technology, there are certain things that newspapers used to do and drive income from that are no longer their monopoly, right? Like the weather, no longer your monopoly. The classifieds, no longer. So we know all of this. So there's also a lot of things that are routine reporting, so to speak, that are commodified in some ways. And AI is going to come for them in next ways that I think are also not something that we should prioritize, because we are not the only megaphone in the room, and it's not even clear to me the other megaphones are bad. In some cases, they're good. They are doing something, but there is things that only, what's the right word? The shoe leather investigator reporting can do. There are things that no amount of smart people, very valuable people, very good people on social media cannot do, because it requires lawyers, it requires FOIAs, it requires time, it requires somebody to fact check, it requires, I like the Substack newsletter model in some ways, but it's also good to have colleagues and editors who say, are you talking yourself into something to challenge you? And maybe you can get to that. I have no problem with that voice, but you need to incorporate how do you do that. And I think the more we do the things we can do with that, the more we also connect with the audience who cannot get it elsewhere. Because the model can't be, here, eat your vegetables, and they don't taste great, but they're good for you. That never has worked. No. So I think that would work. And I'm hopeful it would work, and as it works, I'm hopeful that it would broaden its reach, because I understand it's not everyone, but you find that it was never everyone. You find that footing, and from that footing, people want to come to you rather than thinking, how do we play the algorithm for us? We are we don't care because they will come to us. So I'm an optimist, and I think this is possible. And I think we've been through such challenges before,
Eric.
as Eric was.
I just wanted to point out that historically speaking, lack of trust in the media came much more from the left than from the right.
Yeah.
I grew up in a household where I.F. Stone's Weekly came every couple of weeks or something. My father used to read it. You read that and you discovered that the New York Times, let us say, was simply echoing governmental propaganda as if we were in North Korea or somewhere. And then, as was mentioned yesterday, the way the press dealt with the civil rights movement. Particularly, but not entirely the Southern press.
Black press too. Yeah.
The New York Times lambasted Martin Luther King Jr. when he gave his speech at Riverside Church, criticizing the war in Vietnam. Go back and read that. You'll be that editorial. You'll be very surprised. So. It took a long time, I think, for the media, the mainstream media, to regain trust that they had sacrificed during the Cold War period, basically.
Right. Right. Next question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jim Dingman. I'm a director of the Pacifica Radio Foundation. We have 5 radio stations and 200 plus affiliates in the United States.
Yeah.
So these issues we're thinking about every day. And I'm interested in solutions, not bemoaning these kind of problems, because
Exactly.
I've gone to conferences here for years and the same stuff is repeated again and again and again. There's no solution. So what ideas do people have, and I love the work of all of you, to solve these problems? Because it seems that we need a cooperation with those of us who want to do good work. And I'm talking about the alternative media, I've worked in the straight media, I've worked in the alternative media. We have to come together and figure out how to solve these problems of communicating to the populace of the United States. I sit in a situation where we can communicate to 50 to 100 million Americans. And I always, with my colleagues, we're breaking our brains out of how do we take all the things that some people have in terms of resources. We don't have the resources, but we have the freedom. Some people in the mainstream medium don't have the freedom that we have. So what ideas do you have to change this for the better, as opposed to bemoaning it all the time, which is I've been to conferences, as I say, for 25 years here, same stuff repeated again and again and again. What are the solutions?
Okay.
Bravo. Yeah.
Anybody else? I have a thought, but go ahead. If you could go ahead, please.
Well, I think that it is about resources, right? And there's a really tough conversation for us to have about the business of journalism. And we, are talking about U.S. media, and we're also talking about power matrices around media. And there is a lot of money, certainly in some of the more influential aspects of media, to be made. And I would say that we still have not had that very honest conversation about that. Now, I know that you're going to say that for the last 25 years we've been talking about that, but I don't think so. I think that the election coverage will start in earnest, and you will see some real power players emerge and sit down and do interviews and talk about it. And many of them make, and now again, I'm talking about television media, make upwards of 15 to 16, 17, $20 million. They have a lot of power and a lot of viewership, and their news divisions are getting cut. And so the reporters who need to be out in the field doing the reporting in the communities, which they are trained to do because they love this country, and many of them come from those communities, no longer have the resources to do that. But the audience is hearing from the very powerful people who sit at the top. That is a conversation that we need to have. And it's a difficult one because that is the world I grew up in, and I understand the basic business model, but it's going to have to change. And I also would say we face the same challenges, at Vice and other places, that in the system that we have built, in which, you're really rewarded by financial success, journalism doesn't really make sense because you have to serve the story first. And that just does not fit many financial models at all. So look, I don't have the answer, except that I think we're at a pretty critical point now that we need to really find one.
Do you have something you want to say?
I do want to say, on the resources thing, we've never had journalism that was without some form of cross-subsidy. I mean, when advertisement was very expensive, newspapers took the advertisement money and did journalism with it. That's a form of, so you bought that can of Coke. It's not $1 because sugar brown fizzy water costs $1. That's part of the advertisement. That was a way we subsidized it. It had its problems. Right now, New York Times, it's got a very popular gaming subscription, and it's got the cooking subscription, and that's subsidizing investigations. There's no two ways about it. There is no purely market-oriented currently system that will give you the kind of resources. My colleague Azmat, she won the Pulitzer last year for looking into how Pentagon was covering up how many civilians were dying by those drone strikes that nobody covered, and they were happening to other people elsewhere that we did not travel to or we did not hear from. Took her 4 years, many FOIAs, lawyers, an incredible amount of, like, that's the kind of journalism that I'm very proud, but it's so expensive, and the idea that is going to finance itself is just not there. So you have to have, from philanthropy to nonprofit to ProPublica to subscription to this to that, you have to have this complete rethinking of how do we put money behind the very expensive things, and perhaps there'll be like the cooking part that subsidizes it. There's nothing wrong with that.
And YouTube has to pay for news.
Well, look, before we get to the last question, because our time is up, I think the answer to your question is that, so the next conference should be different. The next conference, at the next conference, I think brilliant academics like Zeynep and others should report on their studies about, for example, how we should work the algorithms the way that the people who spread disinformation work it. There should be reports from the well-funded news organizations about their experiments and things that they're trying and how empirically they're working and how they're not working and what. So we should come out. I think the next conference should be based on data and should be more concrete, and we should take some steps toward perhaps actually, like, let's use a little scientific method here and see if we've tried everything else. So last question.
Thank you. My name is Bronte Gosper. I'm an Indigenous Australian Wiradjuri Kamilaroi woman. I'm also an oral historian and a freelance journalist. I just wanted to note that when the Europeans arrived along the Hudson River, there was a structure that was very based in democracy of the Haudenosaunee people and a strong oratory culture. And this was a model that really inspired the European colonists at that time. I'm thinking about that and I'm wondering, with our question of saving America, do you think that a move towards doing that, or perhaps more fully understanding the idea of democracy, could involve a re-engagement with Indigenous worldviews, particularly by including them in press publications? Yeah, that's my question.
Yes.
Yes, I would agree. As an illustration of how we have to be open to and in fact inclusive of different worldviews and more worldviews, and definitely Indigenous worldviews. And with that, I'd like to thank my panelists. And
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you,
and
Gene.
thank all
Thank
of
you.
you. Thank you.
So I want to say thank you personally to Gene, Subrata, Zeynep, and Eric. And so I'll tell you a little bit to contextualize the video that we have from President Obama, which is that last summer, after I'd been appointed to the deanship, but I had not yet become dean, I spent a good amount of time kind of thinking about what direction we should move in, the things that were most important. And I had these ideas and concerns, many of which would be familiar to you because you share those same concerns. And in the midst of that, I got a rather random invitation to meet with President Obama. And he was meeting with a group of individuals from various media outlets and constituencies, organizations, around disinformation and misinformation. And I took the train down to DC, and we all sat around the table and we started talking, and what kind of unfolded over the next 90 minutes or so was both incredibly sobering and incredibly clarifying. That it really helped. As a matter of fact, this conference is in some measure an outgrowth of that conversation because it became increasingly clear the nature and the extent of the threats to our democracy or our attempts to become a democracy in this society, and the incredible responsibility of journalism at this moment. And so when we reached out, President Obama said he would love to send greetings, to make sure that he expressed his support for this gathering. And so that is how the video that you're about to see came about. And that is the relationship between that conversation and how we came to be in this moment, to be in this room, and to be having this conversation that we're having now. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. I want to start by thanking Columbia Journalism School for organizing this event, and I want to give a special shout out to your dean, Jelani Cobb, without whom we wouldn't be here today. Dean Cobb has never been afraid to tackle tough issues. So last summer, I reached out to him to talk about the role of the press in strengthening our democracy. What I didn't expect was that less than a year later, he would organize a series of events to explore the issues and debate solutions. That's exactly what he did, and I'm grateful to everyone who's participating, including some of the brightest minds in media and academia who are actively working through these challenges every single day. I talk a lot about how democracy is neither inevitable nor self-executing. Citizens like us have to nurture it. We have to tend to it and fight for it. And as our circumstances change, we have to be willing to look at ourselves critically and make reforms that can allow democracy not just to survive, but to thrive. That's especially important right now. Our democracy has always faced its share of challenges, but increasingly it feels like we're at an inflection point with rising inequality, deepening polarization, and widespread disinformation. At the same time, we're also trying to adapt to advancements in technology like AI that could profoundly change our world. If we want to preserve our democratic ideals, we need to face these trends head on, and we need all of you to help us do it. Journalists have always been on the front lines of the struggle for democracy, and some of you have the scars to prove it. And that's why it's so important to find creative ways to reinvigorate quality journalism. It's why we need to keep standing up for the rights of journalists around the world, many who are facing increasing threats and challenges just trying to do their jobs. So what does all this mean for us? As a private citizen, although one that can still get a fair amount of attention, I plan to keep shining a light on the biggest challenges that democracy faces. That includes revitalizing our political institutions, coming up with more inclusive and sustainable models of capitalism, and creating a stronger democratic culture, but it also means creating an information environment that reinforces rather than erodes our democracy. One in which truth matters, one in which we are able to distinguish between fact and opinion, one in which we're able to tell a common story and not just a bunch of separate stories that reinforce our biases and our prejudices. These are areas where we're going to have to do better for our democracy to stay strong. And you are going to be on the front lines of making that happen. I want to challenge all of you to think about how you can make a difference, both individually and collectively, to the cause, not of any particular politics or political party, but to the cause of facts and accuracy and truth and credibility. And that includes all of you who are students. You're going to be shaping the future of journalism and the media. And there are going to be times where business models and technologies are making it tougher for you to do your job. There are going to be moments in which it feels like the only way to get attention is to try to engage in the sort of opinion journalism that gets people angry and riled up and resentful, or just creates controversy and gets attention. and hot takes and clickbait. The problem is if that's all we're doing, then it's going to be harder and harder for us to determine and distinguish between truth and fiction. It's going to be harder for us to be able to have reasonable debates in the marketplace of ideas. It's going to be a lot easier for those who want to polarize us and break us apart. And it's going to be more difficult for us to self-govern. So what you do next, the imagination, the innovation, the determination that you're able to apply in your jobs is going to help determine the fate of our democracy, whether democracy gets stronger or whether it gets weaker, whether people become more divided or can come together to solve some of our biggest problems. Events like this are a great start, a way for us to begin to get some frameworks around these issues and hopefully come up with some solutions. And I'm really looking forward to following your progress. But I hope you understand how important the work that you do is and why it's going to matter to all of us. Let's get to work.
And we are moving into our next panel and covering vulnerable communities. And so I'd like to welcome to the stage Adu Tu, who is the moderator. And everyone here is a faculty member at Columbia Journalism School. So my colleagues Nina Alvarez, Nina Berman, or as they're known, Nina A and Nina B, June Cross, and Daniel Alarcon.
This on? Thank you, Dean Cobb. Thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. Thank you, President Obama, for opening up for us. So it's we're the headliners, I guess. So I wanted to frame this discussion. First of all, I want to thank all the panelists for coming. I'm very honored to call them colleagues, friends, but also very proud that they are some of the best journalists in the world covering important issues. So thank you for doing this. And I wanted to frame this because we are in an institution of learning. We are, most of the work that gets done here, besides these wonderful conferences, is really transferring the knowledge of journalism. And that's I think we can all agree, or maybe we don't, and that's fine as well, that it is a moving target. How we do journalism, how we react to the news of the day, how we cover the communities that we cover. So hopefully we can give you a little bit of that. And as Dean Cobb said, we're all professors here, so while our students pay a lot, you get us for free, at least for an hour, okay? I want to start off with having everyone introduce themselves a little bit, who you are and the kind of work that you do, and then we can jump right into the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Professor Nina Berman. I'm primarily a documentary photographer, and for the last 5-10 years, I've been covering communities impacted by the oil and gas industry and also impacted by U.S. military weapons production and testing. So fossil fuel industry and militarization is my thing.
Hi, I'm June Cross. I teach documentary filmmaking and reporting. I guess journalistic documentary, for which there's short appetite these days. I cover the intersection of race, democracy, public health, all of that.
All of that good stuff. Did that go out?
Hi, I'm the other Nina, and I also work in documentary, also journalistic documentary. I have been focusing on immigration, and my current project, which I hope you will all see sometime in the next few months, is a film currently titled Almost American, about people with temporary protected status who've been living here for over 20 years, who have done everything that most Americans do but are entitled to less or no benefits. And under the Trump administration, their status was terminated, and so they are fighting to stay in what they now consider their own country.
I'm Daniel Alarcon. I'm a professor here teaching audio journalism. And I'm a co-founder and executive producer of a podcast company called Radio Ambulante Studios, and we produce a podcast called Radio Ambulante, which is This American Life in Spanish, I guess. And then a news show called El Hilo, which every Friday we take one big story from Latin America and unpack it. And I run a team of like 34 people doing that.
Great. So let's just jump in. It's one of the difficult things of hosting this panel was we were asked to talk about vulnerable communities, and in a lot of our work, it's very it's important to categorize. You talk about immigration, who are the immigrants, or you talk about politicians, but vulnerable communities seems to me a word fraught with different meanings. Can we talk a little bit about what that means, vulnerable? You all cover different things, but how do you define that, or is it even an appropriate word for this discussion? You can all, Nina A., why don't you jump in?
I think when that term came up originally, I think I thought, I don't know that the people whose stories I'm trying to contain in these 90 minutes would consider themselves vulnerable. I think, especially in this particular story, it is a story about people trying to have some say in what their future is, and that would make them protagonists. But in thinking about it, I think they were targeted because they are vulnerable, because they don't have the same rights as American citizens or even green card holders, right? And they were kind of an easy target because they had a status that was considered temporary, and they could reinterpret the rules and the law to apply it in a way that wouldn't really upset anybody, except for the people who are affected. And they don't have any political power, right? They're no one's constituents. They are, and no politician is really willing to spend their political capital to defend their place here. So I think in that case, yes, they are vulnerable to the political, let's say, whims of the establishment. And so, yeah, I'd say they have vulnerabilities.
I was thinking a lot about this too, because I wasn't sure what the phrase means, but I guess, I mean, to a certain extent, I think we're all vulnerable in a situation in which democracy is being undermined and the institutions are being undermined, and the very concepts of truth and fact and information is all being eroded. I kept thinking about a story we did at El Hilo during the last election about the transnational misinformation campaigns using WhatsApp. So preying on these, we're all very connected, Latinos, and to our countries of origin. We have these giant group chats with 25 cousins and uncles, and it's usually fine and funny, and then it becomes around election time, of either elections there or here, these really toxic flows of misinformation, and it affects the U.S. elections. It affects us directly. It affects in South Florida. And when we saw these shifts demographically, and I thought to myself, that's a vulnerability. That's something that we haven't understood, that how porous and how fluid information is, and how a rumor that starts in Caracas can affect turnout in Dade County. You know, and I think that's a real vulnerability that I've been thinking about.
June, we've talked a bit about this. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think my thought yesterday was, yes, vulnerable communities. It's a euphemism. I've modified my thoughts overnight. Vulnerable is a euphemism for marginalized, which is a euphemism for Black and brown, usually communities. But as I've been sitting here in this conference, I'm thinking democracy itself is now a vulnerable community. My friend Lonnie Guinier, who sadly passed on, used to say that Black America was the canary in the coal mine. And you know, the tricks and legal shenanigans that were used to suppress Black voter rights are now being used on all of us to suppress party voting rights and keep one party in power. So to that degree, I think we're all vulnerable communities, liable to the whims of one party, increasingly liable to the whims of one party. And it's not the first time this has happened in our history, which I think we've covered over the last 2 days here. But it's increasingly something that journalism or journalists who claim to be the first pass at history have to begin to engage with in a tougher way than we have, and stop playing around with, can we use the word lie, for instance?
So, Nina?
Well, communities that I've covered that have been impacted with environmental contamination and harm often are surprised, in a sense, when it happens. So they become overnight activists and never anticipated that something like this could happen to them, and that no one would care, and that there was very little redress, and that their regulatory agencies that they've come to rely on have either been destaffed, dismantled, or corrupted. And so their struggles to sort of remain in their home or continue to have some sense of health and well-being in their environment can go on for years and years and years and years. And so they're in a constant state of disenfranchisement in every level, I would say. And so what's maybe a bad thing for all of us, but also an opportunity for journalism, is that as we all become more vulnerable when we live in a corrupted democracy, that we can make connections between stories that maybe in the past we couldn't.
So we've all mentioned being vulnerable to the powers that be, right? The political parties, the corporations, but also communities are vulnerable to us as journalists, right? We are a part of that system, right? When you talk about agency or disenfranchisement, we're part of that process. Can you talk about the state of journalism, how we're doing journalism right now in terms of identifying communities that do need that attention? And are we doing a good enough job? And if not, how can we improve as journalists? So first of all, is the identifying, we labeled it vulnerable, but what does that mean? And who gets that exposure?
I'll just jump in because y'all seem like you all were thinking. I think
no thinking for Daniel.
No. I just go off the cuff. Look, I think it's in the DNA of Radio Ambulante. We didn't want to continue telling stories about Latino communities and Latin American communities in English with voiceovers. So we created Radio Ambulante, which was to bring narrative storytelling in audio in Spanish in a way to spark conversations that were transnational. We always believed that a good story crosses borders, and that language and culture are much more fluid than geopolitical borders. So that was the way we addressed that problem, and I think it's been successful. I mean, we've seen audiences grow, we've seen audience engagement, we've done events all over the United States and Latin America over the last decade or so that have had really good impact, really good turnout, and sparked really interesting conversations. So that's been how we decided to do it.
So just from a most basic level, just attacking the language issue.
Well, because so much of what we do, if you know, and I'll write for the New Yorker or something, you know, and I'll do a story, and then I cover Latin America, and then I do think language matters. You know, like the first stories that were ever translated into Spanish on the New Yorker website were mine, and I'm really proud of that. El New Yorker. And, you know, that meant that when I covered stuff in Peru, when I covered stuff in Chile, when I covered stuff in Ecuador and Puerto Rico, it gets translated into Spanish, and you were able to have those conversations with the people who gave of their time, who trusted you to tell their stories, you know, who you sat in their living room and they wept in front of you and showed you pictures of their missing mother. You know, like these things that are really, you know, the privilege and honor of being a journalist is that you get to hear people's stories. But the duty is to tell it to the best of your abilities and hopefully, you know, give it back to them, you know, and at a very basic level, you know, getting the New Yorker to translate something into Spanish is a step in that direction. There's other ways, obviously, you know, like, and this may sound dumb, but like, Raambulante, we want to be wherever the audience is. So I don't know anything about TikTok, but maybe we have to figure out how to use it to get to create versions and bite-sized versions of our stories that can reach audiences, engage young people on the questions that are raised by the stories that we spend months and months reporting on. I don't know. I mean, I thought TikTok was just for doing silly dances, but apparently it isn't. And, you know, if that's what it takes, then maybe that's what we have to do.
How about my visual folks over here? How do you give a little bit of that agency back to you know, what we've often called sources, right? So how do we do that?
I give them the power to become experts in their own stories, is the phrase I use often with my students, to allow our character. It's not even allowing, it's like setting aside what you think the story is and asking the people that we often think of as like the real people in our stories, those who are in the text world, let them tell you what they think the story is, or how do they interpret the system that they see themselves living under. They don't always have the details right, but they very often have the big picture more accurately than we will, trying to figure it out from the outside in.
Nina, how about your work?
Well, I think, you know, just very basic, you need to show up, meaning like you actually need to go there and you need to see for yourself and you need to go many times. And if you can't always go there, you need to stay in touch and you need to find out what's happening and what's going on with that court case. And, oh, you've been intimidated again. Oh, there's another lawsuit against you for speaking out. And you just have to kind of follow it through. And you have to do the work, which, I mean, I don't find that fascinating, but is really important, is, you know, understand zoning regulations in the community you're covering, because this is how corporations come in and poison your neighborhood, right? They get permission to do it. So understand how that works. And so when someone is explaining this to you, you know, be informed first so that they're not wasting their time on you. So like show up, be there, be informed, understand what they're saying. In communities I've covered, the kind of my first visits out there, I would find people in like really major distress and didn't really understand it completely when I was there. I needed to be a little better going in at the beginning. And talk to sources that maybe I wouldn't have thought of talking to in the past, like scientists, doctors. You know, if your story's about environmental contamination, what does the pediatric neurologist in the town think? Well, he thinks people shouldn't move to the town if they have kids. That's kind of amazing, right? And he can tell you exactly why. And so I think that, you know, be informed, show up, be willing to listen. If something seems outrageous and surprising, don't immediately discount it. Think that maybe that's where the story is.
I think also understanding the system. I think, Nina, you've been working on this. When you're right. In your film, you know, I think that's the hardest thing for journalists, is to young journalists in particular who want to do people-oriented stories, is there's this huge matrix above them of systems and money and politics and corruption, and it's the stuff that we often leave to the investigative side. And maybe you can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that the most important thing is certainly to listen and commit to listening and really hearing not just the story, but also trying to figure out the bigger picture, the bigger forces that have, because often people just don't understand. Also, like, I don't understand, why am I where I am in life today? And I know that there are other forces at play. And I think that's has been a really important part of my work in the last 5 years, has been really digging deep into how government really works and how really how easy it is to undermine bureaucracies, and why bureaucracy is actually really important, and why we have these safeguards that are supposed to insulate vulnerable people from the whims of one party, for example. But I think for me, you know, I've been sticking with this story for like the last 5 years and really seeing a community evolve. And I think it's really been a lesson for me in how also the media has managed to ignore this story for 5 years. You know, we tend to have our darlings, right? When it comes to marginalized communities, we get very enthralled by DACA, for example. You know, the story of young people who were brought here as children and had no choice in the matter. And I think it's absolutely the right thing to cover. However, when TPS was terminated for Salvadorans, and there were suddenly 263,000 people with families who were told they had to leave in 6 months, what the media did was so disappointing to me, because it was like vultures, you know, hovering above, you know, waiting. They wanted to embed with families as they counted down to their departure date. And then when it didn't happen, they split and haven't been seen since. So, and the fight is still going on. These people are still fighting for their place here. But that's a story that hasn't stayed on the radar. So I think, you know, we can't just drop in on these stories in these communities, and we have to see it through, and we have to stick with it and really commit to not just the story, but to the people who are trusting us with their stories.
So this is all great advice, and I don't think any journalist in the room would argue with any of it, right? Go deep, speak to the people, stay, show up. And yet, we always muck it up, right? The reason we're having this discussion is we have a history of mucking this up, right? What is going on? You know, we have a lot of students here, they're gonna graduate, they're gonna go into the real world of journalism. What are the forces at play that make us do the vulture hovering story, and how can we fight against that? Oh, any of you, but yeah.
I think we need more brown and black people in editor and decision-making roles. That's what's going to really change how we prioritize the stories of vulnerable people, right? We need representation in decision-making roles.
I think it's also understanding the algorithms, as the last panel was talking about. You know, when I first came here, I used to talk about training a guerrilla army of people that would argue with their editors against the framing of stories, the way that they too often get framed, because all of us have to pitch stories, and if you're in this business, after about 10 years, you figure out what it is you need to say to your editor in order to be allowed to go out and tell the story. So there's the pitching of the story, but then there's the actual doing of the story. And the thing to always keep in mind is that your editor actually does not know what the story is, even though they're telling you they do. And it's your job as the reporter to have done a good enough job to persuade them that the story that they think they already know is in fact a news story, and that you've done the digging to understand the connections between the money and the politics, that you understand how folks on the ground are really acting. And too many of us, well, it's not, I won't even say too many, we're working under time deadlines. I have former students who have, in broadcast news, who have to go out and do like 4 and 5 stories a day, and that becomes untenable. And that's a thing that's driven by corporate capitalism, get capitalism out of the news business, I think. I don't know if Eric Tate's here today. He was here yesterday. Anyway, he was talking to me about the fact when Reagan changed the FCC rules and the public airwaves are now no longer public. Everything changed. Capitalism now controls how we work. So, that's a pipe dream reality, but that's my 2 cents.
Well, is it a pipe dream? We want solutions, right? And Nina, we've talked at length about the capital's framing of stories. Can you talk a little bit about, are we trapped to play these games, as June is saying, or can we actually, in a bona fide manner, say, you know what, we're going to do something different?
Well, I think that we tend not to think that our role in journalists is to question dominant narratives. We just kind of figure out what's happening in the community and like, oh, okay, this is bad over here, and this person is doing this, and that person is doing this. But there's a framework behind all that, and we think that public policy people or politicians should be the ones questioning it. But why can't we have that in our stories? So, like, when someone says, we're going to put a military base in your town, it's going to be so great for jobs. We're going to put a prison in your town, it's going to be so great for jobs. How come the journalist never says, who gets those jobs? Do women get those jobs? Who gets those jobs? Who are they for? What's the result of bringing it in? Who gets the money, right? Why is this so good for me? And journalists don't ask that. Maybe they find a person who asks that, but do they really get into, well, what is the impact when you put a military base or a weapons production center or aircraft training over your neighborhood? What actually, who's that good for? And then the people that may dispute it, they're called traitors, cowards, un-American. And we just report that. Can we do better? Say, oh, what is this about? What is this really happening, that someone is not able to speak up against the U.S. military and our $900 billion budget? It's like always extraordinary to me, maybe because like this is my thing in life, is that, we are a country that spent so much money on weapons. And do we feel secure, or are we all so vulnerable to all the things that we've been talking about? So like, what is security, really? But journalists don't ask these questions. Maybe opinion writers say it sometime, but journalists on the ground, why can't we be the people that actually open the conversation too? I think we can play a really great role in doing that. That doesn't mean that we're partisan. It just means we're thoughtful.
Do you think we're too dominated by that fear of being called an opinion or a partisan or or a hack even as a journalist? Is that a fear that we live in that prevents us from doing that?
Yes.
Danielle?
I'm not scared of that.
You're not scared of that?
I'm not scared of it, but I have a tenured position at Columbia Journalism School.
Is that what that's for? Oh, good. No, I'm not. I don't know, but I don't feel like I'm the right person to. I mean, if I had a different role, then I might be vulnerable to that fear, but I'm not really vulnerable to that. And that doesn't resonate with me because of just the kind of work that I do. And it's not that, or the outlets where I publish or where Rambulante, no one. I mean, what has happened is we get attacks from people every time because we are affiliated with NPR, and we get all kinds of attacks like speak English, go back to your country kind of stuff on social media. But that just washes over us. We don't even pay attention to that. But in terms of the rigor of the work that we do, or the connection that we're quite explicit about, the connection that we have with the communities that we cover, and it's not just at a journalistic level. We've done, almost at a company level, we've done a lot to engage our audience and create listening clubs all over the world where, hundreds of people gather on a Monday. Our stories are released on a Tuesday, and listen to our stories in groups, and then have discussions all over the world. So we're like, everyone knows what side we're on. So that doesn't really affect us.
Well, I mean, let's admit it. The five of us on this panel are hyper privileged in the journalism world, right? We're professors here. We get a salary here on top of the journalism we do, right? You have your own business. It's we don't have to deal with a lot of things that many of our students go out to, right, have to do. So my question is, can you only do these stories and ask these questions and punch bad people in the face if you're in a position of privilege? What's going to happen? What should our students do when they come out in May and they want to fight the good fight, right? But they're in a system that, as June says, which is completely true, you have to play the game, right? Our publication, which by the way is a part of a media conglomerate, which is part of a hedge fund at this point, right? What do they do? What are some practical tips for starting? I know they can't change the system right away, but what can they do in May?
Understand zoning.
Talk about that.
I don't know, have you ever tried to get your students to understand zoning? I literally bring people into the classroom to force them to deal with the reality of what zoning means. I mean, just in Columbia University, we would not have a campus on 125th Street right now if the community board hadn't approved the zoning changes that allowed those buildings to be built, and 10,000 people were displaced from their homes as a result of that. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but nobody wanted to cover the realities of the politics that were going on underneath it. And understanding the base level at which change is made in the United States, are those little zoning rules, school board educations at the council level. We don't want to, everybody wants to go cover, Trump versus Jean Carroll, whoop-de-doo. It's like, I'm not saying it's not important, but meanwhile, other things are going on.
Nina, you ever thought of that? Nina B?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like completely unsexy work, right? But you need to begin somewhere, and you have to learn how to sit through it and not fall asleep, and understand, or have someone walk you through, have a lawyer walk you through, or in my experience, when I've covered communities that have been involved in lawsuits sometimes for years, 10 years, they know a whole lot more than I will ever know, okay, in that place. And so I think journalists need to be able to say, I don't really understand what you're explaining to me. Can you explain that to me again? I really want to get it right. And not to be afraid to say that. And then, figure out how an industry or, the U.S. military can come to dominate a place, and then it just exists forever. Once something comes in to dislodge it, like fascism, it's really hard, right? Once it comes in, it's really hard to kick out. And so you have to understand how, it's like an industry mobilizes to come and extract from you. And yes, they have to learn to do the boring work, but I think that if it's not connected to real people's stories, they're not going to get into it, and neither would I, right? So I think it has to be explained that you learn this so that you can actually understand what people are going through and how they are supposed to fight it.
And that takes time. And I think that's the one thing I would advise my students is it's not going to happen overnight, and you actually do have to do that work. You have to actually read court documents. You have to do those FOIA requests. You have to do all that, stuff none of us love to do and spend our Sundays doing that. But there is the larger story, right? There is the people story.
But
and
when you find that little nugget.
Yes, it is so great. But that's the payoff, right? After you do all of that, then when you have the goods, then you go in for the kill.
How entrepreneurial do we have to be now these days to tell the stories that we want in the manner that we want? Obviously, Danielle, you have your own company, but in many ways, all of us, we go through the grant writing process, right? We're not relying on necessarily an editor's checkbook to let us do some of our stories. Is that the only path? To when you like, time takes money, right? You're saying it takes a lot of time, and going through those court documents and learning all that. And Sundays, right? Sundays are free, right? Sundays are free, but is that the path for journalism in the future, especially in the way that a lot of the media, the way every other day we hear about a layoff, right? So is that the path forward for a lot of students? This kind of entrepreneurial approach to journalism?
I think it may be. I'm not. Another one of these panels I sat in this room, someone was saying that students need to think about having their own, not brand, but their own publishing platform increasingly. So I don't know what to say about that. I'm glad I didn't have to do that.
I've had former students, graduates of the school, who've started their own companies or gone to work for startups, and I never thought that I was going to do this. I can't balance a checkbook, but here we are, 12 years later, and we did it. I mean, I didn't do that part of it, but I helped, and I think that it, if you can't figure out, I mean, all of this, right when I started, because I was doing a piece for the BBC, and they cut out all the voices in Spanish, and I was really frustrated, and I was like, well, if they're not going to let me tell the story the way I want to tell it, then I guess I have to do it myself, And it was completely naive and completely stupid, and yet here we are, 12 years later, and I'm sitting here with, these wonderful colleagues, and it's surprising to me still. But if I'd known what it required, I might not have done it. So I think my job as a professor is to all the students who come and ask and want to know about the entrepreneurial side of journalism, to be available and to tell them, so that hopefully they don't run into the walls that we ran into, or that the ways that we figured out how to get around them, we can sort of point them in the right direction.
I don't think I would say that's your first step out of J school. I think I would say try to get a job and try to work with good people who are like-minded but also experienced, and you kind of have to know how to work within these environments, right? How to be subversive in your stories, not just in pitching, but also in telling them, and convince editors that is indeed what they want. And in terms of the question of objectivity, and I've certainly faced accusations of, why do you pitch so many stories on Latinos? I'm like, I'm in Miami. I thought you sent me here for that reason. Didn't you ask me if I spoke Spanish? So there's always this suspicion, right, that you've got an agenda. So you can either embrace it or try to deny it, but it doesn't matter what you do. You have to learn to work with what the media landscape is, what they think they want, and try to get them to see what you're trying to do, even if it's through their lens and their interpretation. I think that's just an important experience for students to have early on.
All right, so we have one go do your own thing and one maybe in a couple months.
No. Wait, hold on. I didn't say that. I agree with Nina. I think that the ideal first, step out of the J school is to find someone who will pay you to continue learning, and find an editor who believes in your work, and or maybe go to a member station and where you get to do a little bit of everything and put in your 10,000 hours. I just came into it this way, and one of the things that I love about this industry, such as it is that you bring in these guests to your class, and I always ask them sort of like, how did you get to where you are in your career? And the stories are so crazy, and and not everyone goes to J school and then comes out and does this. Some people do, and then they go off to work on a farm, and then they discover something and they move, and all kinds of crazy things happen. People change careers, people fall into it. And people discover they love stories, they love facts, and they're good at it. They love people, they love hearing people, and then this is what happens. And yes, definitely, I agree with Nina.
But June, you said you have students who are doing 3 or 4 story quick turns, right?
Well, that's
exhausting.
that is exhausting, and it's crazy. But that's what they're being asked to do. I also ended up starting my own production company because I couldn't get the work done any other way. I have a lot of former colleagues that I see sitting out here, actually. And I think we've all had to fight this fight within whatever structure we're in. And it's sort of finding your way and finding the courage to develop your own voice, which does take time. I mean, like years time, not not like 5 years out of J school. So yeah, I don't have an answer for you.
What about you, Nina? What advice are you giving?
Well, I always tell my students that have a story they really want to do on the side, that they're always looking to do, that they do in whatever spare time they make for themselves, because that's the story that's going to be meaningful to them, and that's also going to elevate them up whatever ladder still exists. That the daily 4 stories a day are just like, go in the ether. Yeah. And so keep your focus on that. In my industry, photographers organize collectively for the past several decades, starting our own agencies and companies to try and gain better control over our work, to negotiate better fees and commissions, to do projects that were not commercial, that we could then put out there to work across mediums and disciplines from art and journalism. But that model has kind of crumbled in the past 5 years or so, as the value of the popularity of images have skyrocketed, but the value of the actual picture has diminished. So I'm at a real loss about how to actually earn a living if you are a visual journalist making pictures, and the whole AI, what that's going to do. It's terrifying when people think that you don't have to meet a real person, you can just talk them into reality, right? But I don't foresee the benefit of like 1 million people on Substack all writing stories, or 1 million Instagram feeds pumping out a story. Like, where is where's the community? Where's the community of an audience? Like, I'm much more attracted to Danielle's model about these listening groups and taking journalism into a group experience. Back in the day, people watched newsreels in a cinema together, right? So
there's this thing called solutions journalism, which gets a bad rap. It's not PR, but it's looking for the small models in communities which are trying to do things differently. And it doesn't mean blindly looking at whatever it is they do and doing rah-rah, but what's working about it, what's not working about it, who's funding it, who's involved in it, why has it gained traction. And I think a little more of that might be something that we could begin to do, even on the daily, on those 4 stories a day, if you can find a time to talk to people outside of whatever your assignment editor is giving you, is one way to think about approaching that. And it's in line with that same idea of allowing the people on the ground to be the experts who are telling you what the story is, as opposed to your assignment editor who's reading the New York Times, and trying to localize it.
Yeah, and I asked these very specific questions about how you actually have a career in this, right? Because longevity is important. Like, these, whatever you call them, vulnerable or not, the communities won't be covered unless you're around to cover them, right? So I have one more question, and then I want to open up to some audience Q&A. But I already see it happening. The run-of-the-mill usual coverage with this election coming up. Now it's what Trump said about DeSantis, right? Soon will be what DeSantis says about Biden, right? We kind of fall into these traps. We talked about the Latino vote, and oh my God, some Cubans will vote like this in Miami, right? Like, I already know the headlines that are going to come. How do we, because we have students here, but we also have professionals who've been doing this for a while. What would be the one thing you would change about the coverage of any topic related to vulnerable communities in the next year? I just bring up politics, as obviously that's the one. What would you change, or how would you reframe the stories that are already being told?
I would ban the phrase Latino vote.
What's that?
I would ban the phrase the Latino vote, for starters, because it's reductionist, and it erases great diversity within people of Latin American origin in the United States, and it's absurd.
It's kind of like what we're doing with vulnerable communities, right? It's this monolith that we were talking about. June, yeah.
Yeah, same thing with the black vote and the woman vote and all those votes. People vote, What was I going to say? Oh, reframe the horse race of politics into the real meaning of what the vote will mean for whatever policy. I mean, Vox did these great, in the last election, they took issues and looked at what it would mean if one candidate versus the other got in. And I think we should be doing that at the local level more often, instead of who's ahead in the polls. I get so tired of who's ahead in the polls. I don't care who's ahead in the polls. Polls don't mean anything.
Can we please not go to New Hampshire and Iowa, right? And can we please find another word to use than conservative? Does anyone know what that word means? Is it fiscal policy? But what is even conservative fiscal policy amongst conservatives? What does conservatives mean in terms of what? Like education? I don't know what that word means. And so I feel like it's just thrown around there to signify Republican Party members, but yeah, we need to find a better word, or not use it at all, and just say, okay, these are the people that want to, roll back all labor laws, right? That's conservative.
All right,
I guess.
So sorry, Nina, 1 second. If we're not going to Iowa or New Hampshire, where are we going?
Well, I mean, we can go there, but we don't have to be like, we don't have to have 200 journalists chasing some minor candidate or even major candidate. I mean, what is the value of that? I had my students go down to the Trump circus in front of the 100 Center Street the day he was arraigned, and they were mystified, like, what? Why are we here? But then also sort of seduced by the whole circus, and it was an interesting moment for them because they could see how they were caught up in like the anticipation of nothing, basically, right? Because the picture was all inside the courthouse, right? There was no pictures outside the courthouse except for people pretending to be Trump supporters. So, but we do this, and we do this because we're lazy. Journalists can be really lazy, and editors are really lazy. Oh, go down, stand there, get the shot of what? Marjorie Taylor Greene? And so, but I feel like we learn nothing. We're just going to repeat the same thing. We're going to look at Trump hired someone because, DeSantis doesn't like her, or she doesn't like DeSantis. It's like, what is this? Is like 6th grade Gossip Girls or something.
Nina?
I think I'm with June on this in terms of get rid of all these meaningless categories that are imposed on all of us,
including vulnerable.
Yeah, actually, yeah. I think, you know, sometimes even you know, when I love watching Jordan Klepper because, you know, he's interviewing all these people about why they support Trump, and they don't ever have a real reason, like not just a good reason or a bad reason, like no real reason, you know, just slogans. So I would, and we had this discussion yesterday about like, well, you know, we were just going back and forth about this idea of let people be experts of their own stories, but at the same time, it's like there are people who you're like, you're voting against your own interests, and I don't understand this. And so I think if, rather than me just being flummoxed and being like, I gotta go, we should spend more time figuring out how that happens. And I think we would probably also not just understand what their motivations are for buying into the disinformation, but also understand them as an audience and understand how do you reach people who have decided that they can't trust us. You know, I don't really know how you do that. It sounds like a huge investment. It means spending time and really listening and hanging out with people you don't see yourself hanging out with. But I think it's really our duty. I think we have been very dismissive of communities that we don't see as vulnerable. White people can be vulnerable, and you know, and they can be poor. And we also don't talk about class in America, and that I think is also something we need to start, like, using that kind of language. You know, we have a lot more similarities than we have differences if we think in terms of class. And so maybe it's also changing these categories if we have to have them.
Danielle, did you? I'm going to invite questions from the audience. And
Hi, my name is Lisa Vives, and I worked for the Jersey Journal, which was a great paper, and now it's about 10 pages long. We have an incredible community in North Hudson, which is maybe 80% Hispanic, and used to be Cuban. Now it's from all of Central America, South America. There are great stories there. All our politicians are Latinos, and every day I listen to WNYC, and maybe I never hear a story about our community. We're 10 minutes from Manhattan. How can we bring more coverage to our area? That's what I'd like to know.
We can send our students, for starters.
Are you easily accessible by public transportation is the question for our students.
Well, I think you're, saying that your paper used to be something wonderful once and isn't anymore, and that there's been quite a loss for the community there, and you're trying to find a way to bring that back. And even though you may not have any control over the finances of the paper or who owns it, and I think that social media can be a cheaper way to do stories if you're not, don't have the website, or there must be some Spanish language radio station there, or I don't know, Danielle. I'm not laying it on you, but sometimes radio can be cheaper, and just in sort of getting out there, and maybe more people would listen to it, and so maybe there's some alliance, right? So that's how vulnerable communities survive, by allying with each other, right? And some solidarity in the journalism market there.
The Sarah Alvarez out in Detroit has this really interesting model with Outlier Media that they do a lot of reporting on WhatsApp. I mean, that's where they found that communities are getting their news anyway, and so they created a news project that's specifically geared to that's their platform where they publish.
So they report and publish on WhatsApp.
well, I mean, they do regular reporting, but they also publish directly to WhatsApp. There's another group out in Oakland that does something similar in indigenous languages. I can't remember the name now, but there's interesting projects out there. I do think that the newspaper is not coming back. That's not the future. There's a lot we can learn about what newspapers have done and what's been successful over the years, and there's a lot of value that we have to celebrate and move into the future, into the next model, which I don't know what it is, but I do know for certain the newspaper is not returning. And so what do we do, and how do we, the communities still want information, communities still want to see themselves represented in coverage, but they're not going to the newsstand. That's not where they're getting their news. So how do we meet audiences where they are? I think that's got to be the key.
Hi, my name is Manny Narat, class of '80.
Welcome back.
There are two communities, vulnerable communities, that I didn't hear addressed. One is you, the journalist. We saw in the opening clip, right? Press, and the guy got sprayed. So how do you deal with that? And the other is, how do you deal, and I was in documentary when I was here in '80, and we did a story on the Lower East Side when it was being gentrified. And it occurred to me then, and it occurs to me right now, that when you interview people, you're making them vulnerable, especially in this day and age where things go viral. And so how do you, especially when there's big money involved, and local politics are really violent, how do you manage and balance your exposing these people to potentially violence when you know you're going to be leaving? So there's no way. I understand there's no answer to that, but it's a dilemma that even back in 1980 we kind of had, because we were kind of felt like we were exploiting very, very vulnerable people.
That's a couple of great questions. You should have moderated this panel. But I want to take the second one first, because obviously we're concerned for our own safety, but the second one I think is very germane to what is on our mind right now. How do you go in? You go in, they're already vulnerable, whatever that means, right? But you're really putting a target on them if they get in your films and your stories on there. How that's a great question. How do you protect?
Yeah. In my case, in the film that I'm trying, I follow a family for almost 5 years, and it took like 8 months to get a family on board, and there was a mutual concern of like, wow, what happens? Like, what if they're involved in a lawsuit which was already kind of risky for them. It felt like they were more vulnerable because of their involvement in this lawsuit, but they were also from a country where challenging the government could mean, being disappeared or murdered, at the very least detained. So there was that fear, but also there was the fear, like, my material could be subpoenaed, and they were involved in this case. What if interviews with me could be used against them, or what could they tell me? So I'm very mindful of what was at stake for them. And I engaged the Knight First Amendment Center, and I said, these are the concerns. What do I do if my tapes or my video is subpoenaed? And they said, we will fight for you. We will do everything we can to protect that material. This has come up for me in the past. I have had material subpoenaed. I gave the drives to my mom and was like, don't tell me where you're putting it. I don't know nothing. And then they dropped it, fortunately. but I think it is our responsibility to ensure that we are not compromising someone's safety. That has to just be part of your planning, part of how you are going to work. And I think working in places like in Central America and Mexico, that's always been part of the way I think about how I'm going to engage people, is if I'm asking them to tell me something that can put them at risk, I have to think about how do I, protect them, or how do I at least not put them in any more danger than they already might be in.
How much conversation do you have with your sources? That First Amendment's great, but if it gets subpoenaed and they lose, right, there's exposure. So what kind of discussions do you have about the potential dangers with your sources? Because I don't think everyone knows. When we report, I'm not sure they all know. So how do you all approach that?
I have a real hard time with journalists who don't. Who I've seen, stories where I'm like, how did they get that person to talk? Because this is not a smart move. And I've seen colleagues just not mention it and be very extractive and just say, sign this release and we're good. And that to me is just ethically fucked up. I'm sorry, that's just not, I hope that's something our students wouldn't engage in, that they would know that we have a responsibility to people who share their stories, especially when they are in a vulnerable position at risk of their personal safety, or their family is at risk of any kind of harm. We have that responsibility to let them know, right? To say, I worked on a film with girls who were being sexually exploited and commercially sexually exploited, and they all wanted to be on TV. And it was, and I worked with someone who had no ethics, right? And he was didn't care. And
You thought it was a huge win, right? That they would all be.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He was the idiot that offered the DA my video. And thinking that'll get us something, I don't know. But it was up to me to set a limit and really explain, look, you're 19 years old. Yes, you are at an age where you can make this decision, but I have to explain to you. And I had to really feel like you get what this means. Because if you don't, this pops up 10 years from now, it can be really re-traumatizing, or it can, what if you're running for office and something comes up like this, So there's real consequences in real life that, you're right, I get to walk away, I get to, I move on to the next thing, but they have to continue living the consequences of those kinds of actions.
And Nina Berman, you talk a lot about consent, right? And your whole work is the image, right? And often an image of a person that any context can be thrown on them, especially in social media. So what kind of conversations do you have in terms of protecting them?
Well, I think that at a different stage in my career, I would have sought more to get access to people, right? Because that's the get, right? To get access, to get them to trust you. And I've definitely pulled back from this idea and more lean towards talking to people who are already talking out about things, as opposed to finding that person who's never encountered the press. Because I feel like the people who already are speaking out, or maybe in the case of sexual violence occurred years before. You don't have to find someone to talk to where they are just right in the midst of the trauma. And so someone who's already had some time to process things, these to me are better sources now, because they are already have thought it through, have already exposed themselves, as opposed to just taking someone, with no experience. And I think that this really has to be a change in our conversations and newsrooms, because I'm not sure editors understand that yet. And it also, it's not just about things that we in the past have thought of as vulnerabilities. Think of mass shootings, right? School shootings. Parents who grieve their children publicly are now demonized, okay? Attacked. Think of Uvalde, what happened there. Think of, Sandy Hook. Those parents were still being attacked. And so, if an editor says, go and talk to this family that, lost their kid, well, push back on that. Our young journalists have to learn how to push back on that. Well, maybe I'll talk to someone where this happened 10 years ago, right? Or a friend of someone else, because we're throwing them to the piranhas out there.
I think we have, before we get yanked, like 5 more minutes, is that right? Or are we done, Dolores? Okay, we have another question here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Penile Ramirez, class of 2022 for business. I want to follow up with Nina Alvarez's comment about class. Do you think that the fact that we have been categorizing more in race terms than in class terms is also key to understand why we don't get the coverage of the white supporters that Trump has and have had?
Say the last part of your question again, sorry.
So if we categorize from race coverage to class coverage, do you think that could be part of the answer to how we, as I think, we haven't get a proper coverage or a deep enough coverage of Trump supporters?
Oh, yeah, I think, look, race is certainly a factor. It's a big factor, right? Like, some might feel like, okay, I'm poor and I'm white, but at least I'm white, right? But yeah, I do think that there are, if we look at it differently, if we look at those issues, like poverty is affecting not just certain races. It may, affect one race more than another in a certain place. But I think that if we really were to look at through a class perspective, through that lens, we might find more common factors between racial groups than we do now. And I don't think we've gained much by focusing on racial groups, at least in election coverage. The black vote, the Latino vote. Latino vote is like, that's just a stupid term, because there's very, very wealthy Latinos, and there are very, very poor Latinos, and there are Latinos who can vote, and there are Latinos who cannot, and we have mixed status families and all kinds of issues that you could really probably understand a little bit better in terms of class than you could or immigration status, which is a class also. It's also a class system. So there's different ways of kind of organizing your thoughts about how what the issues really are about. But it's been, I think, a convenient way to organize sectors for really lazy journalism.
Well, it's a holdover from the old days when, the newsroom was majority white and everybody else was the other. But I think it's necessary to also point out that there are a lot of very wealthy Republicans who are supporting Mr. Trump, and it's not all poor guys who think they're better than everybody else just because they have white skin. There are also Trump supporters who just hate government, period. And that has nothing, and they will argue with you over whether or not they're racist, even though they see that the result of their, I mean, Dean Cobb and I worked on this story on voter suppression. I can't tell you how many people I spoke to who argued with me, I'm not racist, I just don't like this government. The government is corrupt. The government's telling us what to do, and it shouldn't be telling us what to do. The fact that the end result of their position and their support for Trump means that other people get stamped on, that their rights get stamped on, just isn't that important to them. They have another issue that's more important to them. So I think, you know, this idea of categorizing people in these huge ways, I think, works against us. And so, like, I come back to this idea of euphemisms and avoiding the avoidance of euphemisms in all ways, just to be specific. What are we actually talking about when we talk about these things?
Great. Dolores, are we up or? Okay, sorry, can we take one more? No, we're up. Okay, okay, well, I want to thank my panelists for coming. Sorry, we couldn't take that last question. Yeah, come up and ask them. Thank you, Nina, June, Danielle. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And
thank you very much for being here this morning.